question is, how common was it for people to survive a crucifixion? I'll start this off by saying that in this country, before they introduced the drop with hanging, people quite often survived hanging because it was a form of slow suffocation, didn't break people's neck. And then they'd come to when they were about to be dissected. And they were described, in fact, they described themselves as being resurrected. So, you know, this idea of consciousness, unconsciousness, coma, what's the difference? Well, we think we know. But back then, you know, they had a much hazier idea of this state. When Josephus, who was a Jewish historian who'd defected to the Romans in the Jewish war, at the end of it, he was granted a number of favours, and one of which was from the long line of people who were going off to become slaves or slaughtered in the amphitheatres. He was able to pick out some of his friends, and he happened to see 3 of his friends who were being crucified, hung up on crosses. Probably the slow method of crucifixion, whereby you were just left there for 2 or 3 days until you died of all sorts of things. And he asked them to be taken down, and they were, and 2 of them died, and 1 of them did survive despite the ordeal. So it did happen. But of course, if you've nailed someone through the wrists, at the very least, to the cross, and if you're in control, and if in fact you make sure they stay there, then they will die. If they're taken down early enough, who knows? Hello, my name is Peter Cresswell, and I'm here to introduce my new book, The Invention of Jesus, How the Church Rewrote the New Testament. I'm going to do this with regard to Easter, as this is coming upon us, but the book itself details the earliest Greek manuscripts of the New Testament and how the church gradually, through them, manipulated its text to suit its doctrines. But with regards to Easter itself, which I will use to illustrate the theme, the church had a particular problem with the resurrection, the early church that is, because there was at the end of the 1st century an alternative story circulating amongst Jews in Palestine of a man called Yeshua in Aramaic, or Jesus in Greek, who stood up against the Romans, was captured and crucified. But this wasn't a story of death and rebirth. This was a story, however historically correct or not, this was a story of survival. Now, what there was certainly at this time also was a breakaway sect within Judaism, shorn of all the dietary restrictions and the requirement for circumcision. And it was aimed at Gentiles because Jews wouldn't have any of it. Now, as new converts came into this sect from the pagan world, they brought with them their own myth of a dying and resurrecting God-man, into which the story of Jesus neatly fitted, and over which the instigators of this cult, because it was so geographically dispersed, did not have very great effective control. When it came to the sect writing down its narrative, the first copy that we have of that comes through in the Gospel of Mark, from which all the other Gospels, essentially, for the Passion narrative depend. And this Gospel, in fact, has no resurrection at all. It ends when the women arrive at the tomb, find it empty, and a young man there in a white robe telling them that Jesus has gone on to Galilee. This, in fact, is foreshadowed in the previous text, but in fact, there's nothing further beyond that. So it seems to be that something has been cut, the ending has been cut. But why has this happened? Now, later editors of the Gospel of Mark tried to fill in the gap, and we have a couple of surviving bits of this. One is a 1-verse roundup, and there's also 12 added verses. This is in fact called the longer ending of Mark, and it famously has the signs by which you can recognize believers, including, for example, the ability to swallow poison without harm, handle snakes, and cast out demons. Now, that unfortunately was where it was at the time. So how can we decide what might have been in this earlier original Jewish story that has been cut? Well, there's 2 sources of possible information. One of these is the later Gospels, which tried to fill in on this, but it's rather patchy, and it seems to be mostly based on fragments of oral remembered text. For example, there's Matthew, where the disciples and Jesus meet up on a mountain. One of the sources of possible information are the later Gospels, which in fact seem to have used all sorts of fragments of oral testimony. For example, the Gospel of Matthew, which has Jesus meeting up with the disciples on a mountain, but it's very vague. And then there's the Gospel of Peter, where they go on a fishing expedition together. And the Gospel according to the Hebrews, where his brother James seeks him out and they have a meal. And there's similar sort of descriptions in Luke and John. Now, all of these things are really sort of very ordinary things, such as a person might do, rather than a miraculous being. Then the other source of information is the actual narrative of Mark before you get to the abrupt ending. Now, in this narrative, it actually does seem to have borrowed the original Jewish story, which is of survival rather than death and resurrection. And the most crucial thing is that the crucifixion as an act of execution wasn't completed. Because what killed people when they were put on a cross for a short time was not the indignity, not being tied there by the feet usually, or tied or nailed by the hands. But what killed them was a heavy blow that was delivered to the legs, which then broke the legs. The body could no longer be supported. The victim then couldn't breathe because of the difficulty of lifting up the chest, and they also suffered from the trauma and the blood loss into their legs, and they would die then within a very short time. This didn't happen. And there are other curious things too. The trial and the events before the crucifixion would seem to have been happened or contrived to happen just before the onset of Passover, which happened also to be the Sabbath in that particular year. And it was quite important for the Jews to get bodies down from the cross before this happened. So Jesus was only on the cross for a short time. Someone else carried the heavy crosspiece to the place of execution. And there are other factors too. For example, just before he slumped forward into a state of seeming death, he was given a drink of vinegar on a long reed. Now, this is what's described in the canonical Gospels. But in the Gospel of Peter, it's described as vinegar, which would have been mildly stimulating, and gall, a bitter substance, which actually might therefore have been something that would have induced this state, possibly a poison, possibly an opiate. So if you look at that, together with the succeeding narrative in the later Gospels, you've really got a suggestion that the Jewish story was one of survival, and then what was described afterwards was a man who was walking around, meeting with his followers, and doing ordinary things. And there, in fact, the story rests for the moment, and we can go forward another couple of hundred years. Now, in the mid-4th century, something very extraordinary happened. And this is that this Christian sect, which had been persecuted intermittently, and in fact, in recent years, just before that, with great severity by the Romans, suddenly took center stage when the Romans, under the Emperor Constantine, adopted Christianity as one of the religions of empire, which was of power. Instead of being persecuted, they were now near the center of power. And there was just as suddenly a demand for the Christian texts to be spread throughout the empire. Now, we have, in fact, a very important document from this time which has survived, and it's called Codex Sinaiticus. It contains the earliest complete copy of the New Testament that we have, and it's also has the Old Testament as well, although some bits of that haven't survived. And the Codex was rediscovered at the end of the 19th century in a monastery of St. Catherine's on Mount Sinai, hence its name. And it's now largely kept, most part of it, in the British Library. Codex Sinaiticus was regarded for a long time as a reject manuscript, because there are a vast number of corrections, far more than any other Greek manuscript from the same period. And the theory was that it was written, not completed, It had a large size that made it slightly unusual, and then was left abandoned, and a couple of centuries later someone came along and corrected it. But in fact, the main corrector to this Bible was the first corrector, and this person actually managed to produce a very, very good finished copy. And my suggestion is that this first corrector didn't come from 2 centuries later, but it was actually a contemporary with the scribes, was in fact the scriptorium corrector. So the manuscript was actually completed. And if you take the combination of enormous haste with then very careful correction by someone following on, plus the fact it was then kept and conserved for many centuries, doesn't have the signs of wear that you would get from a Bible that was used for ordinary everyday reading, then the very strong probability is that this was created as an exemplar from which to make further copies. And in fact, we do have one copy, another manuscript from the mid-4th century called Codex Vaticanus. Now this one is named because it was found in the library at the Vatican, and it's been there since the first catalogue was compiled in 1470. There have been competing claims as to which of these 2 manuscripts was the oldest, but I've done an analysis of the errors in the manuscripts, and I've been able to show that for the large part of the New Testament, Codex Vaticanus was copied directly from Codex Sinaiticus. So we have one example of a copy made from it. It's a very important Bible indeed. Now, there is a lot of evidence in Codex Sinaiticus of manipulation of the text by the scribes, by the scriptorium corrector. And there are 3 sheets that were written in the New Testament by a second scribe. The rest of it was largely written by one scribe. And then 3 single sheets were written by a second scribe. An extremely unusual pattern of working. Now again, the traditional theory was that these sheets were in fact correction sheets for blunders made by the second scribe, by the first scribe. And indeed, they show enormous compression. So the suggestion is that the scribe, in writing this, forgot huge chunks of text. Errors that are so unusual, they happen nowhere else. Very large chunks of text. So these couldn't be put into the margins as a correction. So after the manuscript had been finished, the sheets were pulled out, and the second scribe did the work and put in the corrections, cramming in the text. Now there are lots and lots of problems with this. If you can imagine the way a book is produced nowadays, it's produced with quires, which are sheets that are placed on top of each other, folded in the middle, stitched together. You can't do it with all the sheets. The book wouldn't fold. And this book was in fact done the same way. The quires consisted of 4 sheets put together, folded, stitched, and then all the quires themselves were stitched together. 4 sheets, 3 of them, in fact, consist of inner sheets. And the point about an inner sheet is that the text on the first folio is discontinuous with the text in the second one. And the point about these sheets is this enormous compression happens not just in one of the 2 folios, but in both of them. So for this theory to be correct, you have to imagine that the scribe, the initial scribe writing it, made some catastrophic error and forgot a large amount of text. And then just a few more pages further on, made the similar catastrophic error in a connected sheet. Now, the probability of this happening is remote. It is so unlikely. And what is more, there are lots of little significant nudges and adjustments within the text that indicated that the 2 scribes were aware of the adjustments, the writing that each was making. So in other words, it wasn't written later, it was written contemporaneously. So in fact, what happened was the first scribe actually gave away a whole sheet to another scribe. He wrote up to it. Then, in fact, he resumed a bit further on, copying from his manuscript. He went on, and then, of course, with the sheet having been given away, he had to jump again. And what happened, of course, each time he did this, he had to calculate how far along to go in his original manuscript from which he was copying to leave text for the other scribe to fill in. It's very, very easy to miscalculate this. And that's how, since he did it twice, he made the mistake in both halves of these double sheets, and that's why you get the compression in both halves of the sheets. Now, the question is, why on earth would they have such an unusual arrangement? It happened in the Old Testament with books or parts of books, but it's just so inconvenient to do it this way for single sheets. It causes so much difficulty. Now, my theory for this actually marries the question of the pattern of working between the scribes with the actual content of the manuscript. As it happens, these three sheets contain what I believe, in fact, is a reasonable judgment, are the three most contentious passages in the entire New Testament. One of them is in the first letter from Saul or Paul to the Thessalonians. And this is where Saul or Paul is given to describe the Jews as Christ killers. He blames the Jews for the death of Jesus. And in fact, this happens on a slightly more attenuated form in the Gospel of Matthew. But this is the starkest accusation. Well, clearly, this wasn't true. The Romans crucified Jesus, and it was very well understood at the time. But the important point is that now, under Constantine and his successors, the Romans were the patrons of the new sect. And so this was put in order to please the Romans. Now, I'm not suggesting that it was necessarily invented at the time, but it was quite possibly put in from a version that had less good provenance, that was created a little later. Now, the second sheet where this happens occurs within Matthew. It's disconnected, but Matthew is quite a long gospel. And in there, the bit that is contentious is the part where Jesus, in fact, creates Simon, his follower, as the first effective pope and gives him authority over his church. Now, there is nowhere else in the New Testament where Jesus is described as founding a church. There's no historical evidence for it. There's no other document that describes this. The church was something that was, with its deacons and bishops, which was something that was a later creation. So this is something also that had inferior provenance, and I suggest was from a different text substituted in at the time. Now, the third sheet is very interesting because this is the sheet that has the end of Mark and the beginning of Luke. So we're back to where I started in this talk. And this one happens to be an inner sheet of a quire. So there's no question of the discontinuous sheets here. But instead of compression, very unusually, the text at the end of Mark in Codex Sinaiticus is enormously stretched out. In fact, what happens is, on the first page of this, on the recto, it's compressed first of all, then you turn over the page, then it's stretched right out at a very low level of text compared with the rest of the New Testament. Now, why was this done? Well, actually, what we have in Codex Sinaiticus, and also in Codex Vaticanus, which I suggest was copied from it, is the abrupt ending of Mark. And what seems to have been done is that it's been stretched out because an ending has been excluded. What I suggest was done was that the first idea was to put in the longer ending of Mark with snakes and demons, substituted that for the ending that was there. Because the amount of space, if you take into account all the adjustments, the amount of space that there was for this ending that was excluded is less than the 12 added verses, but fair amount of text. So in other words, it was compressed because they thought a little bit, because they thought they'd put in the 12 verses. Then they decided against this. And the reason they decided against this was that it's very well known that this particular ending was by a second person later on. It's discontinuous. It doesn't have the same, it doesn't connect, it doesn't have the same language or grammar. It's very clear. It was recognized at the time by Constantine's bishop Eusebius as being bogus. So what happened there then was that in this case, this sheet was written by a second scribe who they decided between them to eliminate the ending of Mark that was there in the first scribe's original manuscript. So, evidence essentially of editing of the text. Do I think that we will ever get back to the original Jewish story? Will we find some manuscript on a scrap heap somewhere in the Egyptian desert that's been desiccated over the centuries? Or will we be able to reconstruct it in some ways? I think this is likely to happen. But what we will find is not the miraculous story of the resurrection that the church has been promoting, but what we would find then is the original Jewish story of survival that the church has, over the centuries, tried to suppress. Thank you for listening. What happened if, after the crucifixion, if there was a survival? I've been very careful here to suggest that the earlier Jewish story was one of survival. That's not necessarily correct any more than the Christian overlay. In other words, he could have survived a short time and died, or whatever. There is some evidence for this story of going to Kashmir. I think there's also evidence that he might have gone back to the sect that harboured the Messianic claimants, and this is the Nazareans, that many people believe was very similar to the Essenes and possibly the same group. And this was a sort of fundamentalist movement at the heart of Judaism. And what happens when you're under occupation is that the fundamentalism tends to become more important. People turn to that. And in fact, there was this movement at the time, and they did harbour people that came out from time to time, like John the Baptist, made a fuss, and were unfortunately one after another beaten down by the Romans. So there isn't evidence, clear evidence, as to what actually happened. I intend to do something further on that, though. I think the church cut it short because by this time it had absorbed this pagan myth of resurrection, the dying and resurrecting God-man, and had become committed to it, unfortunately. Well, it had become committed to it. So it couldn't have a story where there was a naturalistic ending, and therefore it cut it. And that's the reason, I suggest. Relates to Saul, who became Paul, and his Jewish roots and how he came to take on board the resurrection argument. Now, I have written about Saul in an earlier book, Jesus the Terrorist. I tend to follow Eiserman's view about Saul, and that is that he may have been a member of the Herodian family, a minor member of the Herodian family. That doesn't mean to say he didn't have some Jewishness, because the Herodians were descended from Idumeans who had been forcibly circumcised. So they saw themselves as Jews, and some Jews might have thought they weren't really very proper Jews, so there was a certain degree of snobbishness there. But if you look at Paul's letters, a lot of them are obviously fakes written later. A lot of people will agree with that, but the ones that are regarded as authentic, if you see the progression through those, I've argued that it seems to indicate that the original argument between the Nazareans and Saul's sect was over circumcision and the requirements, dietary restrictions and so forth. It wasn't about Jesus at all. And I don't think there was much about Jesus at all. If anything, that was added later to the letters. But unfortunately, as these ideas came in, he had to adapt to it. And in fact, he did this by arguing that, he did argue that Jesus was born according to the flesh, and he produced progressive arguments suggesting that he sort of gained godlike status by attribution, by his death and so forth. So Saul's views, in fact, evolve through his letters, if that's any help. Right, this is a question about the missing years, from the birth stories to the passion narrative, where there's very little. The birth stories, I suggest, are pretty bogus and were added later. So in fact, the missing amount is huge. Right, why isn't there very much about that? Well, I think people were interested in the passion narrative and so didn't write about it. But my view is that the Nazareans, so Jesus didn't come from Nazareth necessarily, he was a Nazarene, and in fact it's been mistranslated throughout. The Nazareans were this fundamentalist core within Judaism, and they harbored these claimants to the throne of Israel, and essentially that's where they were all this time. But they then came out in order to proclaim the message of resistance. It's very similar to the Maccabees about a century and a half beforehand. They were a movement, and as one person died, another brother or son took on the mantle. And they in fact managed to gain independence. So this was in fact a submerged line of messianic claimants and never actually got power, but were there. And why were they harbored within the fundamentalist core? Well, this is because Herod instituted the persecution and eliminated all the Maccabean rivals that he could, and this was still going on. It happened quite recently. It was still going on in the early years of Jesus' life, and James, his brother, and so on. It was with the sort of middle years. And that's when, I think it's possibly in Luke's Gospel, it could be in one of the others, that's when Jesus is, they're taken to Jerusalem, he's taken to Jerusalem, and he stays behind. His parents lose him, and he's found talking with the elders. And in fact, they're not telling him, he's telling them. So the idea is that he gained all his knowledge because it was somehow divinely given to him. Now, what the early Christians did was that they used the Jewish stories for their own purposes, and I think this is possibly a manipulation of the fact that Jesus spent some time with the elders, who would be the Nazareans, Essenes, some time being a number of years until he came out from the sect. So a number of years is collapsed into a very short time, a couple of days when he's left behind, and that's how he's got his knowledge. So the stories that you see have been manipulated to serve a purpose, and sometimes they're manipulated to defuse the original ideas that were threatening to the church itself, because they related to the Jewish story of survival, the Jewish story of rebellion against the Romans, the Jewish story of opposition to Rome, and they twisted these around in order to people would say a few generations on, oh, I remember this story my grandfather told me, and they come along and say, no, it wasn't that, it was something slightly different. And they say, oh, perhaps it was. So the idea is you take the story, the facts that people are familiar with, and you change them a little bit. So, and then of course it becomes, over time, it becomes the official version, and there's no one else to counter it. I believe this comes in the Acts of the Apostles, where they say one of the particular communities they started were then suddenly called Christians, and from that point onwards. But it doesn't specifically say when this happened, except that you can deduce that it didn't happen at the outset, so it happened a few years later.
Why do you think that Rome, ancient Rome, took up the idea of Christianity and adopted it fairly early on, and the conversion of the Emperor Constantine and all of this?
Well, the Emperor Constantine, I think, was a very astute person from a political point of view, and he rose to power by battling with several other contenders and defeated them one by one. In the eastern part of the church, Christians were being persecuted, and Constantine recognized that, if he was going to defeat his enemies, it'd be useful if he could have the Christians on his side. And there's a description of the battle of, I think it's Milvan Bridge, where he saw in a dream, but however it came to him, he had the idea of sending in his soldiers into battle with the sign of the cross on their shields. And it was quite astute in my view, because the cross was a Christian symbol, of course, but it was also a pagan symbol. So he managed to have his soldiers. So in fact, he needed to unite his empire, and he was quite happy to have more than one religion, as long as he could keep them within his control. And in fact, he was more concerned about whatever it was, and didn't bicker about it.